I'm Dr. Habibi, and in this course, I'm going to teach you anything you need to know about cardiovascular physical examination.
Systolic murmurs are divided into 4 groups based on where in systole they are heard the loudest. Early systolic, mid-systolic, late systolic, and pansystolic or holosystolic.
The first group of systolic murmurs are early systolic murmurs. That is, those that occur at the beginning of systole but do not extend to the end of systole. What diseases lead to early systolic murmurs? Acute mitral regurgitation, acute tricuspid regurgitation, and muscular VSD. The factor that determines where in systole the murmur occurs. It's the pressure gradient, meaning when the maximum pressure gradient is at the beginning of systole, the murmur will also be early systole. In a patient with acute MR, we have an early systolic murmur. But in a patient with chronic MR, we have a holosystolic murmur. What is the reason for that? When we have acute mitral valve regurgitation, during systole, blood flows from the left ventricle into the left atrium. Right at the beginning of systole, as soon as blood enters the left atrium from the left ventricle, the pressure in the left atrium rises so much that the pressures on both sides of the valve equalize, and this leads to the limitation of mitral regurgitation. The same thing happens in acute TR as well. But in a patient with chronic MR, because the left atrium has adapted over a long period to the blood entering it, the atrium becomes enlarged during systole. Therefore, the murmur is heard from the beginning to the end of systole. That's why the murmur of chronic MR is pansystolic. We have 2 types of VSDs. One is muscular VSD and the other is membranous VSD. In a patient with muscular VSD, the defect is located in the muscular part of the septum. Because it is muscular, the septal muscles themselves tend to limit and reduce the size of the orifice and defect, and eventually it may close on its own. For this reason, in muscular VSD, the murmur is only heard at the beginning of systole, when the defect has not yet been limited or closed. But in patients with membranous VSD, since the defect is located in the membranous part and there is no muscle involved, even when the ventricles contract, the orifice and defect still remain. That's why a membranous VSD leads to a holosystolic murmur. Therefore, in a patient with a muscular VSD, since the defect is in the muscular part, with contraction of the ventricles and septum, the defect becomes limited and the orifice disappears. Therefore, the murmur and turbulence caused by muscular VSD are only present in early systole. But in a patient with a membranous VSD, since the defect is in the membranous part and not in the muscular part, the left-to-right shunt persists even until the end of systole, and the murmur can still be heard. The second group of systolic murmurs are mid-systolic murmurs. Mid-systolic murmurs have a crescendo-decrescendo pattern. That is, they rise in intensity and then fall in the second part. Mid-systolic murmurs are divided into 4 groups: valvular, supravalvular, subvalvular, and those caused by overflow. Valvular murmurs are those that occur at the level of the aortic and pulmonary valves. That is, aortic stenosis and pulmonary stenosis. Supravalvular murmurs are those that occur above the level of the valve, such as coarctation of the aorta and supravalvular web. Subvalvular murmurs are those that occur below the level of the aortic or pulmonary valve, such as in patients with certain conditions, hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy, or those who have infundibular hypertrophy below the pulmonary valve. Mid-systolic murmurs caused by overflow are those in which the valves themselves are normal. But the amount of blood passing through the valve is increased compared to normal, which is why it leads to the creation of turbulent blood flow. In murmurs and trills caused by overflow, the valves are normal, but because the blood volume has increased, it leads to turbulence. Imagine that 10 people are supposed to exit through a single door. Normally, if they leave one by one, no problem occurs. But if those 10 people become 50, then there will be congestion when trying to exit through that door. We call this overflow. And this is what causes turbulence, and that turbulence leads to the murmur being heard.
If you found the video helpful so far, please like it and share it with your friends. And if you don't want to miss my upcoming videos, please subscribe.
Are divided into 3 main groups. Those that are pathological, those that are physiological, and those that are innocent murmurs. Pathological ones include VSD, ASD, aortic insufficiency, and pulmonary insufficiency. Physiological murmurs are due to pregnancy, anemia, fever, and hyperthyroidism. And innocent murmurs are those harmless murmurs heard in children and young people. So why do physiological murmurs occur? As we know, any factor that causes an increase in blood volume, such as pregnancy, fever, or hyperthyroidism, leads to an increase in cardiac output. This rise in cardiac output and blood volume results in overflow across the aortic and pulmonary valves, which is why it leads to the development of a mid-systolic murmur. What are innocent murmurs? Innocent murmurs, or harmless murmurs, are caused by overflow or increased blood flow across the aortic and pulmonary valves. That's why these murmurs are best heard at the base of the heart, meaning the second intercostal space on the right and left sides. They are usually mid-systolic. They are low-grade, accompanied by a thrill, and their intensity is at most less than 2 out of 6. These murmurs increase when lying down or in the supine position, and decrease when the patient stands up. The intensity of innocent murmurs also increases with breathing and respiration. How do systolic murmurs caused by overflow or hypervolemia develop? Let's first talk about VSD. In a patient with VSD, the interventricular septum has a defect. Because of this, blood flows from the high pressure area, which is the left ventricle, into the low pressure area, which is the right ventricle. And this increased blood volume leads to an overflow across the pulmonary valve. As a result, the blood flow becomes turbulent, which leads to the development of functional pulmonary stenosis. How does a patient with an atrial septal defect end up developing a mid-systolic murmur? In ASD, atrial septal defect, the defect is in the septum shared between the atria. Therefore, blood easily flows from the left atrium into the right atrium. As a result, once again, the right ventricle experiences volume overload, because in addition to the blood it normally and physiologically receives from the SVC and IVC, a large amount of blood also enters the right atrium and eventually the right ventricle from the left side, that is, from the left atrium. Therefore, once again, this leads to increased flow and overflow across the pulmonary valve, resulting in a mid-systolic murmur caused by functional pulmonary stenosis. The next condition that leads to a mid-systolic murmur is aortic insufficiency or aortic regurgitation. In these patients, the aortic valve is incompetent. For this reason, during diastole, blood flows from the aorta into the left ventricle, causing the left ventricle to experience volume overload. Then, this large volume of blood must once again pass through the aortic valve during systole, which leads to overflow across the aortic valve. And this increase in blood volume and the overflow that occurs across the aortic valve leads to turbulence over the aortic valve and the auscultation of a mid-systolic murmur caused by functional aortic stenosis. In a patient with pulmonary insufficiency during diastole, blood flows from the pulmonary artery into the right ventricle. Therefore, the right ventricle experiences volume overload because in addition to the blood it normally and physiologically receives from the IVC and SVC, a large amount of blood also enters it from the pulmonary arch. For this reason, the RV, that is, the right ventricle, experiences volume overload, and during systole, this large volume of blood must once again pass through the pulmonary valve. Therefore, this leads to overflow across the pulmonary valve, and this overflow causes turbulence, which ultimately results in the audible mid-systolic murmur known as a functional pulmonary stenosis murmur. Therefore, the 4 diseases that pathologically lead to a mid-systolic murmur caused by overflow or hypervolemia are as follows. A VSD leads to functional pulmonary stenosis due to overflow across the pulmonary valve. An ASD leads to functional pulmonary stenosis due to overflow across the pulmonary valve. Aortic insufficiency or aortic regurgitation leads to overflow across the aortic valve due to functional AS. And ultimately, pulmonary insufficiency or regurgitation results in overflow across the pulmonary valve and causes a functional pulmonary stenosis. The third group is late systolic murmurs, meaning they are heard more at the end of systole. For example, mitral valve prolapse. How does MVP or mitral valve prolapse lead to the development of a late systolic murmur? In a patient with MVP or mitral valve prolapse during systole, when the left ventricle contracts, the mitral valve prolapses into the left atrium like this, and after the prolapse, the leaflets of the mitral valve separate from each other to some extent, leading to mitral regurgitation. This means that blood enters the left atrium from the left ventricle. Now, why is the murmur caused by MVP heard at the end of systole or late systole? Because at the beginning of systole, the pressure in the left ventricle has not yet risen enough. Therefore, the leaflets of the mitral valve have not prolapsed yet. But in the middle and at the end of systole, when the pressure in the left ventricle rises sufficiently, that's when the mitral valve and its leaflets begin to prolapse. Mitral regurgitation then occurs into the left atrium. Therefore, MVP leads to the development of a systolic murmur, which is heard at the end of systole. That is, first the mitral valve prolapses into the left atrium, and this prolapse of the mitral valve can be heard as a mid-systolic click in the middle of systole. And after this systolic click, the murmur of mitral regurgitation caused by MVP is heard. The more severe the MVP, the earlier the mid-systolic click is heard. That is, it gets closer to sound, therefore the length of the marble increases. Conversely, the less severe the MVP, the later the mid-systolic click is heard and the murmur is short. Cardiac maneuvers also affect the murmur of MVP. Any maneuver that causes the left ventricular volume to decrease will increase the severity of MVP or mitral valve prolapse. Therefore, the mid-systolic click will occur earlier and the length of the murmur will increase. Any maneuver that causes the left ventricular volume to decrease, such as standing or the Valsalva maneuver, will result in the mid-systolic click being heard earlier. Therefore, the length of the murmur increases. And conversely, any maneuver that increases the left ventricular volume, such as squatting or performing a leg raise, will cause the mid-systolic click to be heard later. Therefore, the length of the marble becomes shorter. The fourth group is holosystolic or pansystolic murmurs. This means that they are heard throughout the entire systole, from the beginning of systole to the end of systole, such as chronic MR, chronic TR, and membranous VSD. In patients with mitral regurgitation, during systole, blood flows from the left ventricle into the left atrium. In individuals and patients with chronic MR, because the volume of the left atrium has increased. So no matter how much blood enters the left atrium from the left ventricle during systole, there is still room. And for this reason, the pressure gradient remains throughout the entire systole, from the beginning of systole to the end of systole. Therefore, its murmur is heard as holosystolic. The disease is also called chronic TR. Has blood entering the right atrium from the right ventricle during systole, and since in these cases the right atrium has enlarged, no matter how much blood enters the right atrium from the right ventricle during systole, there is still space and room. Therefore, this pressure gradient and the difference in gradient exists throughout the entire systole. It is also heard as holosystolic or pansystolic. We have two types of VST in the muscular part of the septum, and the murmur it produces is early systolic because during systole, when the ventricles contract, the septum also contracts, and the defect or orifice that exists essentially limits itself. Therefore, its murmur is only heard at the beginning of systole. But patients who have membranous V, ST, the defect is in the membranous area. So no matter how much the ventricles and septum contract, this orifice still remains, and there continues to be a pressure gradient between the right and left ventricle. In patients with membranous VST, the location of the defect is in the membranous area, not in the muscular part. The membranous area is also located in the outflow tract of the ventricles, that is between the LVOT and RVOT. For this reason, throughout the entire systole, from beginning to end, blood flows from the left side to the right side and a pressure gradient exists. That's why the murmur is caused by the vocal cords. ST is heard as holosystolic. In other words, it is continuously heard from the beginning of systole to the end of systole.